Good afternoon. Yeah, what a healthy response. It must be the upcoming summer that's got you excited. I see some of the golfers here that played yesterday. We won't ask them to report on their scores, but apparently they had a good meal at Mac and Bob's after the. Thanks for coming to Reflections. It's always fun to learn about our neighbors, and our presenter today is Tom Shannon. And Tom been here about 10 months, something like that. His primary career was in academics. He taught for about 30 years down at Radford and taught sociology. But we know Tom primarily that he is a very pleasant dinner companion. He is a good conversationalist. He loves his dog, plus other dogs. How many rescues have you had, Tom?
I've lost count.
Lost count. You will see him riding his bicycle around the campus, and if you walk by his apartment, which is anyway on the ground floor, you'll see all kinds of interesting lights in his windows. I asked Tom, I said, are you an exotic plant guy? He said, no, I just love plants. And he said they're mostly house plants and not fancy orchids or something like that. And I said, are you, and we talked a bit about gardening before he came here. He said his home before he moved to Brandon Oaks was probably over-landscaped in terms of plants, both flowering plants and decorative plants as well as garden plants or produce plants. So I said, are you a master gardener? He said, no, I'm just a compulsive gardener. Above all, I would say that Tom has an outstanding sense of humor. And I say that because I have sat adjacent to him in a couple of presentations, and he laughs every time I do. Tom, we welcome you. It's all yours, my friend.
How's this? Can you hear me okay? Good. Let me warn you, I have lung disease and I also got some allergies, so if I have to stop every once in a while, cough, blow my nose, whatever, please understand. What I want to talk about today is not about a lot about my adult career. I had a really great adult career. You know, I was a college professor at Radford for 30 years, and you know, I thought that was a really great racket, right? What happened was the state of Virginia paid me to read books that I like to read, write books that I like to write, and to talk about things to people that I like to talk about. I thought that was a pretty good way to steal money, you know. So I thought it was really, really fortunate that I ended up there. But it wasn't really obvious in my early life that that's where I was going to end up. Because I really didn't start out very well as a child. And what happened was a bunch of kind adults intervened in my life and changed my life and made me able to end up in that wonderful career. And that's what I want to talk about today. Let me start with a story. Back in 1975, I was home for Christmas, and I had just got my PhD from Michigan, and I just started teaching at then Radford College. And my mother told me the story. She says, in 1951, we had just moved to Omaha. You were in first grade. We transferred during the school year. And at the end of the school year, you got your first Omaha report card, and it was awful. You got C's and D's. And you know, those report cards also had those little other things that they graded on where you got, you know, satisfactory and unsatisfactory, and I got a whole bunch of unsatisfactories. And there was a little note saying the teacher wanted to see my mother. And so she went to see the teacher, and the teacher said approximately this: "I'm sorry, Mrs. Shannon, but your son, little Tommy, probably is never going to do very well in school, and you better just get used to the idea, because he is mildly mentally retarded." Now, why would she think that? Well, in fact, there's some reasons why she would have thought that. I was, in fact, off to a bad start as a child. As a small child, I was very small for my age, very underweight, almost fragile. I was sick all the time. I was hell on wheels to go on vacation because I was car sick all the time. Can you imagine that? When I entered school, I was the smallest child in my class, male or female. First in kindergarten, first grade, and second grade. Every childhood illness that came along, I didn't get sort of sick. I got really sick. Right? In first grade, at the beginning of first grade, I was playing outside with my brother, who was 4 years older than me and very athletic and big. And we were just roughhousing, and I broke my arm so badly that I had it in a cast from my shoulder to my fingertips, almost till we moved to Omaha. And I learned to print with my left hand because it was my right arm. No wonder the teacher thought I was slow and retarded, right? I was absolutely timid and shy. I walked around looking at the ground most of the time. I didn't look in people's faces ever, right? When we used to visit my aunt and uncle out in Nebraska on vacation, my aunt used to call me her little old man because I was tow-headed, right, bright white blonde hair, and I walked around with my hands in my pockets, looking at the ground. So the teacher made an understandable mistake. And things didn't get any better in second grade. I had a real old, nasty, school-marm kind of teacher who terrified me. She was a real strict disciplinarian. And I didn't respond to that very well, so I didn't do very well. Then I got sick a lot. And it culminated in getting measles in February. And I didn't make it back to school because of complications until the middle of April. Right? My mother homeschooled me and worked with the school teacher and got, brought assignments and everything. But the school board had a policy: if you missed a certain number of days of school, you couldn't possibly be allowed to go on to the next grade. I'd missed too many days of school. My mother, bless her heart, appealed that policy to the school board and got it reversed in my case, only because back in the mid-1930s, her first job had been as a school teacher in a one-room school in rural Nebraska. So she had been a licensed Nebraska school teacher. So they allowed me to go on to third third grade. So there I was, sort of a not thriving child. Nowadays, I guess, you'd hire a therapist, get a bunch of specialist doctors, right? What my mother did is she called her sister in northeast Nebraska, who lived on a farm, and said, we're going to come visit like we did last summer with the 3 boys. Only when we leave, I want to leave Tommy behind. I want him to spend the summer on the farm. And that was probably the best thing that could have happened to me. The farm was a typical little family farm, 160 acres, corn and some pasture land. They had dairy cows, raised hogs and pigs, chickens. That was pretty much it, right? They raised the corn to feed the livestock. Livestock was their cash crop. My uncle was not a wealthy farmer. He had just gotten a tractor for his first time in 1950. A 1940 John Deere. Boy, he was proud of that machine, right? He still had his horses. He didn't want to get. He was a sentimental man. He didn't want to get rid of the horses because they just sent him to the glue factory. So he still had King and Prince in the barn. It was a little family farm. They weren't rich. They had just gotten electricity. When we visited in 1949, when I was really tiny tyke, they hadn't had electricity and they hadn't had running water inside the house. But in 1951, they did. Right? They were all nice and modern. My aunt, a few years older than my mother, had married when she was in her teens. And they'd had one child, a son, and hadn't been able to have any more. The son was already grown, out of the house, and married, had his own farm. So I got to stay with my aunt and uncle. My uncle was a great guy, built like a barrel. You never saw him outside of bibs and a blue work shirt and quarter boots, right? When he went to town on Saturday night, he just wore newer ones, right? And my aunt, big boned, tall woman, kind of skinny, loved to talk. My uncle's reaction was, she'll chew your ear off and then look for something else to chew on. But she was a wonderful cook. She loved to bake. She made a fried chicken to die for. And that was a staple food for them. They didn't eat much beef. And I got to stay there for the summer. And the idea was I was going to eat lots of Aunt Margie's foods, a lot of fresh air, and see if I couldn't gain a little weight. And what that summer was like was I basically tagged along with Uncle Julius every day. And turned out Uncle Julius probably missed not having had many children. He loved kids, and he loved having me around. And what he really loved about it is he loved showing me how to do stuff. The big surprise was the very first week I was there, he taught me how to drive the John Deere. Right? I mean, we're talking about, there's a little tiny kid. I weighed about 52 pounds at the time, right? I couldn't even reach the brake pedals and sit on the seat of the tractor, right? I had to stand up to drive the tractor because I couldn't sit on the seat. And this was a big old tricycle John Deere with the huge, rear tires and the little tiny front tires. And so he said, "Oh, no problem. You can learn how to drive this. It's real simple." The throttle was on the steering column, so I could handle that. And it was just one thing after another. He was doing something. He'd show me a tool and show me how to use the tool, right? We'd get the team out because he still had some of his equipment was horse-drawn, so the horses would have something to do. So I'd get to drive the manure spreader with the team. And it just became one great adventure after another, right? Now, some of the adventures I didn't care about. I really didn't care about my aunt teaching me how to pluck chickens, especially after I learned watched her slaughter chickens. She had her chicken killing shoes, right, which were a slightly raised heel, and she just popped the heads off and threw them out in the yard and let them run around. But the thing is, by the end of that summer, I had gained a huge amount of weight, right? I was basically, had, eaten my weight in home-baked bread, fried chicken, apple pie, you name it, right? And more importantly, by including me in all their activities and getting me to learn how to do all those things, they gave me a sense of agency, a sense of competency that I'd never had before. I could do stuff. How many kids in my class could drive a John Deere? Okay? And by the end of the summer, I was really driving that John Deere, right? I'd drive the John Deere. Well, he and his son and his brother were loading bales of hay, right? And I'd be driving the John Deere. My uncle thought nothing of it. It was just, and he said, "Don't tell your aunt." But the thing is, that made all the difference in the world for me. And I came back from that thing in August. I completely outgrown all my clothes. But I also wasn't walking around looking at the ground. And from that, that experience, I gained a little bit of self-confidence. I was still an introvert. I'm still an introvert now. But I wasn't that pathologically shy, depressed little child that I had been. A little fresh air and a little attention. A little practical therapy in northeast Nebraska on the farm. Third grade was a totally different experience. I wasn't the smallest kid in the class. I wasn't pathologically shy. I sort of fit in. And for the next few years in grade school, I sort of did okay, right? I wasn't a particularly good student, but I wasn't a bad student. I was kind of a dreamy kid, not very engaged. I did okay in school, got okay grades, but I didn't try very hard. I skated along. It was an improvement, so my parents didn't hassle me much. Right? Nobody was calling me, mentally slow anymore. And B's and C's were okay. And I would sit in the back of the class, not say much, not hassle the teacher, and get my B's and C's. Good enough. The one thing that my mother was able to do, she was a reader. She belonged to Book of the Month Club, Reader's Digest, remember those things? Right? She enticed me to try to read adult level books and said, well, you'll just figure out the words as you go, because that's how I learned. And she was right. By the time I was in 5th grade, I was fighting her for the books as they came in, right? And I was reading at the adult level. So I wasn't all that great in school, but boy, was I a good reader, right? And when we moved back to Chicago, I remember her have a fight with the suburban librarian in that Chicago suburb because they didn't want to give me a high school level library card because I was in 6th grade. And my mother threw a hissy fit and got me that high school level library card. Then my father got a new job. He was in the railroad industry, and he changed railroads. He went to the East Coast, to a New England railroad headquartered in New Haven, Connecticut. And we moved to a small town north of New Haven that was just starting to become a suburb called Cheshire, Connecticut. And that suburb, typical little New England town with the village green and the white church on the village green, and all that sort of stuff. That town had just started its own high school and junior high, and it was a mess. They didn't even have a building for the junior high yet. They were meeting in the church basements. And my parents took one look at that. My brother was a senior in high school, and he was going to be trying to get into college. And I said, and the high school wasn't even accredited yet. And they said, this is a problem. But there was an out. And right off the village green was a nice tree-lined little campus for what is so common in New England, an old New England boarding school called Cheshire Academy. It's founded in 1790. They've been around for a while. And they took day students, a few from the town. So my parents had a supply, and they let us in, both me and my brother in. And they did a good job for my brother. They got him in the Brown the next year. So that was pretty good. My strategy of sitting in the back of the classroom didn't work, because the classrooms were glorified closets that held 6 to 10 students around a table where the instructor, who was called a master, right, sat at the table with you. No place to hide. And you better have done the homework. You better know exactly what's going on, because you got called on multiple times every class. The day started at 8 o'clock in the morning and wasn't over until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Right? 2 hours of the afternoon were mandatory sports. Totally structured, totally controlled environment. You had classes on Saturday. Saturday was test day, because you got graded weekly on a numerical scale, 90, 80, 70, 60. And those grades went home to your parents weekly. Uh-oh. And on top of that, they posted the damn grades by your name, so everybody knew what you got that week. And the whole thing it was totally competitive, where everybody was competing with each other to get higher grades. what an awful circumstance that was. No more skating for me, right? Right? Where everybody was, did you get an 83 this week or an 85 this week? It was, it was incredibly competitive. And of course, I didn't want to look like a total idiot, so I actually started to buckle down, right? But the real thing that changed for me was I had an English instructor who got my attention. He got my attention by telling me that, in fact, I was a good writer. I've been reading all this literature at the adult level, and apparently that had just sort of rubbed off, right? And it turned out that when I started turning in essays, at first he was suspicious that I wasn't writing them myself. And when I finally convinced him I was writing them myself, he said, well, you have a natural talent for writing, and you need to develop that talent. That was heady stuff for an 8th grader. And he said, I'm going to have you write extra for me so that I can help you work on your style. Right? That was heady stuff. I had a mentor, right? Somebody who was going to go the extra mile to help me develop a skill. And that was heady stuff too. And what happened was that lit a fire under me for the first time in my life. I stopped being that dreamy kid who just wanted to drift along. I wanted to be good at what I was doing. By the middle of that 8th grade year, I was getting either the highest or the second highest grades every week. I was in a competition with this guy who was a scholarship boy from Brooklyn, right? And it got to be so people were placing bets. Boarding school is really boring, right? Little stuff becomes exciting when you're locked up in boarding schools, right? And people were placing bets on who was going to win that week, right? And so I went from somebody who thought of himself as not much to somebody who thought of himself as someone who could excel. I stayed just 2 years at Cheshire, and I was actually overjoyed when my father got another job in New Jersey. Cheshire was not co-ed, right? And that was getting to be, as far as I was concerned, a major problem. And so we moved on to New Jersey, to a relatively affluent Jersey suburb with a big high school where everybody was competing to go to an Ivy League college, right? But by this time, I was primed to compete. And I jumped right in. There was an honors program there, and they let me right into it based on my grades from the academy. And I got straight A's except for one damned math class. Much to the relief of my major competitor, who'd never got a B the whole time she was there, damn it. And so she was valedictorian, and I was salutatorian, And I got good college boards, and I applied to 3 Ivy League schools and got into all 3. And on the advice of my brother, he says, "You don't want to go to Princeton, it's all male." Right? He says, you want to go to Penn. You'll have a better time there. And so, based on that wise advice, I went to the University of Pennsylvania. I arrived at Penn. I was a good student and intended, again on the advice of my older brother, he says, you're only going to Penn so you can get into a good grad school. Don't mess with the idea that you're just going to get a bachelor's degree. Nobody just gets a bachelor's degree. He had graduated from Brown, and he was at Penn too. He's in the Wharton School, right? And so I had that fixed in my head, that I still had to get good grades because I was going on in grad school. But I had no idea what. I had no idea. Was I going to be a lawyer? Was I go to law school? I knew I wasn't going to go to med school. That didn't appeal. Maybe I'd get a PhD and become a college professor. I didn't know. I started out as an English major just because I had to choose a major, right? I had no idea. That would seem to be the easy thing. I like to read a lot of novels, so I'd be an English major. And I stayed that way all through my freshman year. My sophomore year in the fall, like all colleges, universities, they had, general education requirements, including social science requirement, and I had to take a social class. And so I took this class with this somewhat eccentric professor, E. Digby Baltzell, who was the child of the Philadelphia upper class, also somewhat colorful. He had been a fighter pilot on a carrier during World War II. Anyway, actually it was a really great class. I really liked it. And at midterm, he turned back the grades and talked about it and everything. At Penn, you never had multiple choice. It was always all essay. And turned back the essays. And he said, I gave some of the same essay questions to my graduate students in the social theory class, just to see what would happen. And he says, I want to commend you. You all did pretty well compared to them, including one student here who wrote a better essay than anybody in the graduate class. And then at the end of the class, he said, Mr. Shannon, I want to see you. How'd you like to go to the faculty club for lunch? I said, sure. So we went off to lunch. And he says, you need to be a sociology major. You're the one who wrote that essay that was so good. He says, you have a flair for writing about and thinking about sociological issues. You're a natural for that. Try a few more sociology classes and then switch majors. I followed his advice. I was pretty much, absolutely bowled over by E. Digby Baltzell. I took several more of his undergraduate classes, switched majors, ended up getting honors in sociology, Phi Beta Kappa, blah, 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 and applied for graduate school in sociology and got into the University of Michigan, which is one of the top departments. And the University of Michigan gave me a free ride, 100% support, no work requirement, no teaching requirement, to a program in demography where I would get, in 1 year of concentrated study, a master's degree in demographic analysis. They would pay my tuition, they would pay my living expenses. All I had to do was show up and study. Sounded like a pretty good idea, so I said yes and showed up at Michigan. A year later, utterly exhausted, 12 months later, I had a master's degree in sociology. And I had decided, no way in hell I was ever going to be a research demographer. Hell would freeze over first. Right? The idea of spending my life working at the Census Bureau or the CDC with a bunch of dreary demographers, no way. So I said to myself, I need to take a break while I sort this out. Well, I've got a master's degree. I could teach at a community college. So that's what I did. I got a job in a little community college in central Illinois, Illinois Valley Community College, which was a brand new school. This is during time in the late 60s when all the states were creating community college systems. And the college consisted of 14 temporary buildings in a cornfield. And so I showed up there, right? The ink wasn't even dry on my master's degree. Right? I was 23 years old, 1 year out of undergraduate school, and I was going to be a college professor. Never taught a thing in my life. That was a recipe for disaster. Fortunately, this community college was loaded with former high school teachers who'd gotten master's degrees and become community college teachers. And they were ready for people like me because they were old high school teachers. They were used to teaching people to teach. And so my division head, who was the other sociologist, right from the get-go, started to tutor me in the art of teaching. How to put together a lecture, how to organize class discussion. He would sit in on my class, and it was very non-threatening. He wasn't evaluating me. He was just giving me suggestions. And he taught me the art of teaching in a way that most people who get PhDs never learn. And he also made me love teaching. This was a tough place to teach. It was a factory town. It was a town of about 20,000 people, and almost everybody in the town worked for one company, Westclox, a blue-collar factory town. These kids were tough. You needed a chair and a whip to go into class. If you didn't know what you were doing, they would eat you alive. But if you did, it could be an incredibly rewarding experience to reach kids like that, especially the ones who decided to go on to the four-year state system, where they were getting out of LaSalle, Peru, Illinois, and Westclox. I did that for 3 years, and I also maintained my relationship with the University of Michigan. I passed my doctoral exam, comprehensive exam while I was teaching at IVCC and did some other work. So I was still part of that program. And at the end of 3 years, they said, all right, you've gone as far as you can go remotely. If you want to get a PhD, you got to come back and do your dissertation. So I went back to Michigan 3 years later. And after 4 years of the usual agony the dissertations involve, finished my dissertation at Michigan. But I knew one thing. I was going to be a teacher, not a researcher. That what I loved was the teaching transaction. That's what I wanted to do with my life. That the folks down at IVCC had corrupted me. and corrupted me permanently. I was a teacher, not a researcher. And so when I started looking for jobs in the spring of 1975, I looked for small, teaching-oriented colleges and universities. And one of them was Radford College. And they offered me a job. And they promised me that I would be primarily evaluated on whether or not I was a good teacher. And that's how I ended up at Radford. Thanks, that's all I've got.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
Okay. You done?
Yeah.
Okay. Questions? Wait a minute, Janet. Use the mic.
Hi, Dr. Shannon. I'm a graduate of Shenandoah. Oh, listen to me. Well, I am a graduate of Shenandoah University. That's my master's degree, but my Radford was my undergraduate degree, and we were living at Ferrum College at the time because Jim was teaching at Ferrum. And so 3 of us faculty wives drove up Shooting Creek Road, up through Floyd to get to Radford
I've
for
been
8
on that
o'clock
road.
classes. Well, anyway, the reason I'm asking, what year was it that Radford began to take male students? Do you recall?
It was 2 years before I got there, 73. So when I got there, all the juniors and seniors were still all female. Sophomores and juniors, there were some males. Not very many, a bunch of very dazed, happy males.
Joseph.
While you were talking about how you were mentored, and how that twisted the twig, I kept thinking, what did you do to hundreds and thousands of students to twist their life?
One of the hard things of being a teacher is you never really know, usually, right? Sometimes somebody will come back and visit, or you'll hear something, but 99% of the time, you never know. And you just have to have faith that you've done a good job. That's all you can do.
I've got a question. Dr. Shannon, you have devoted your life to study of sociology. We live apparently in an unprecedented cultural divide in our world. We see division on all kinds of things, and even developing into violence. What is your take on our cultural divide and where it might lead?
I am really afraid that it's a divide that is going to get worse, not better. I think we have gotten past some sort of turning point where it can be healed. And I think that probably means that the prospects for our political system is probably not good. I hate to say that, but there's a fair amount of literature on why democracies fail. And we in the United States is on a trajectory that fits the failure pattern of other democratic systems that have failed. When conflict becomes this deep-seated, this bitter, democratic systems have difficulty surviving. Democracies are fundamentally political systems that survive based on compromise. If you can't compromise, you can't legislate, and you can't govern. And this is no longer a political system that can govern. Take a look around you. The political system no longer can govern. You can't get anything done in Washington, right? They hate each other. The political system is paralyzed because of this conflict. And maybe some miracle will happen. We'll wake up and we won't go over the cliff. But right now it seems like we are headed right over the cliff.
So what we really need is a hero, Superman, right?
So I guess. But I hate to say that. I hate to have such a pessimistic view. But there's an organization called Freedom House that rates how functional democratic governments are, and how well democratic governments are functioning. We're way down the list now. We rank like 40th or something among democratic governments. So many of our democratic institutions are non-functional now. How many seats in the House of Representatives are contested seats, where either party could possibly win? It's only a couple dozen. Most people go to the polls and they have no choice of who's going to be their representative. It's a foregone conclusion. We are so deeply divided, right? We have gerrymandered our political districts so that, there's no political choice. That's not democratic. But it also means that you have this permanent, locked-in conflict. What do I think of climate change? It's just, it's another external variable for our society that is, very threatening. In principle, as a technical question, it's possible to respond to climate change. The technology now exists to deal with the problem. The problem is economic and political. The expense of doing it and the political will to decide to do it, right? It's cheaper now to use solar power and wind power than to build a steam power plant, right? It's not, the technology is there. It's the question of doing it.
People on the planet together, desperation, think the planet will evaporate. Then perhaps we can change something
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
and that might be the motivation.
I don't know. Yeah. Again, it's more a political and economic question, I think, than a technical question, right? Right.
One at a time, on your way out, everybody join in a chorus of Over the Rainbow.
Great.